from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 42, Beelzebub in America. Reading 6. At any rate, my dear boy, I must admit that certain customs existing there, which have reached the contemporary favorites of yours from remote antiquity, are exceedingly good for the ordinary existence of the beings of certain communities there. These customs are good because they were invented and introduced into the process of the existence of beings by those three-brained beings there, who brought the perfecting of their reason up to so high a degree, as unfortunately none of your contemporary beings there any longer attains. The contemporary beings, are able to create only such customs as make the quality of their psyche still worse. For instance, they have recently made a practice of always here, there, and everywhere dancing a certain dance called the foxtrot. At the present time, this foxtrot is indulged in everywhere, at all times of the day and night, not only by young and still unformed beings, who do not even begin to be aware of the sense and aim of their arising in existence, but also by those whose faces clearly express, as it can be constated by every normal, more or less sensible three-brained being, that in respect of their duration of existence, as our teacher would say, not only have they one foot in the grave, but even both. The point, however, is that the process of the experience in a being during the said foxtrot is exactly similar to that which proceeds during that children's disease which the great Moses called Mordorten, the disease which the great Moses devoted half his existence to eradicating from among children. A host of your contemporary favorites of responsible age have, almost deliberately, resurrected again and spread not only among children and the general mass of adults, but also even among the aged as well. These good customs for ordinary existence reached your contemporary favorites from ancient three-brained beings of your planet, and very many now still exist there among the beings of various communities of the continent Asia. Certain of these customs existing there now appear, when first witnessed, as absurdly strange and barbaric, but on a close and impartial investigation of the inner meaning of any of these customs, one can see how skillfully there has been incorporated in them, for the people who follow them, one or another moral or hygienic benefit. Take as an example one of the most seemingly senseless of the customs there, one existing among a certain tribe of Asiatic beings called Colenian Lurs, or Colenian Gypsies, dwelling between Persia and Afghanistan, and which other beings there call gypsy self-fumigation. Exactly the same end is served by this seemingly stupid custom as by the Persian custom of ablution or abdest. This gypsy tribe is regarded as the lowest and filthiest of all the tribes existing on the earth, and indeed they are so filthy that their clothes are always swarming with the insects called lice. Their custom of self-fumigation also serves, by the way, to destroy these insects. Although the men beings of that tribe are indeed exceedingly filthy, yet not only do no venereal diseases exist among them, but they do not even know and have never heard that such diseases can be contracted. In my opinion, this is the outcome entirely of that custom of theirs, which some ancient clever being there invented for the welfare of the people of his epoch, and which, passing afterwards from generation to generation, chanced to reach these contemporary filthy beings of the tribe of Colenian gypsies. For this rite of self-fumigation, every family of gypsies has also what is called an ateshkaini. That is, a stool of special form, which they regard as sacred, and this whole ritual of theirs they perform with the aid of this sacred stool. Every family of these gypsies has also what is called a tandoor, that is, a special kind of earth pit, such as is found in the houses almost everywhere on the continent of Asia, and which serves as a hearth on which they usually bake bread and prepare food. In these tandoors in Asia, they burn chiefly what is called kiziak, a fuel composed of the dung of quadruped animals. The rite itself consists in this, that when the family of these gypsies returns home in the evening, they first remove all their clothing and shake them in this tandoor. It is almost always hot in this tandoor because the dung burns very slowly, and the ashes formed around the kiziak keep the fire burning for a very long time. By the way, it is interesting to remark that when these gypsies shake their clothes in the tandoor, a highly interesting phenomenon results from this action of theirs. Namely, the lice in their clothes crawl out and, falling into the fire, explode before burning, and the various sounds of the explosion of these lice, large and small, produces altogether a surprising musical symphony. From the said explosion of the lice, a hearer sometimes has the impression that somewhere not far off, firing is going on from several dozen of their what are called machine guns. Well then, after these worthy gypsies have shaken their no less worthy clothing, they proceed with the sacred ritual. First of all, they solemnly and with a certain ceremony lower their sacred family stool into the tandoor, and in turn, according to age, they step into the tandoor and stand upon it. The sacred stool consists simply of a small board to which 4 iron legs are fixed, and by this means it is possible to stand in the tandoor without burning one's feet in the hot ashes. As each member of the family stands on that sacred stool, all the other members of the family sing their sacred canticle, while the one standing upon this stool, slowly and solemnly, bending the knees, lowers and raises himself, and at the same time recites prayers. The custom requires that he should do this until every part of his sex organs has been warmed by the tandoor. A second custom, very similar and seemingly just as stupid, I saw among the people of another small tribe called Tusuli Kurds, dwelling in Transcaucasia, not far from Mount Ararat. This tribe is not filthy, as is the tribe of the Kalenian gypsies. On the contrary, from their daily bathing in the river Aras, and existing mostly in the fresh air, being chiefly shepherds, not only are the people of this tribe very clean, but they even do not give off the specific odor which is peculiar to people of almost all the small tribes which populate this great Asia. Each family of this tribe has its own what is called hut, which serves as a dwelling and for the reception of guests, as the custom of visiting one another is highly developed among the separate families of this tribe. In each hut it is customary for them to have, in the corner of the front section, what is called a sacred mungal. That is a hearth on which a fire of smoldering charcoal or of the said kiziak is constantly kept, and near each such sacred mungal there hangs a small wooden box called ktulnots, which is always kept supplied with the roots of a certain plant. The rite of self-fumigation consists in this, that every member of the family and every guest of either sex, before going into the principal section of the hut, is obliged to enter this sacred mungal, in order, as they say, to purify himself from the influence of those evil spirits by which man is surrounded when he is busy with honest work. And this purification is carried out in the following manner. Each person going into the hut must approach and take a few roots out of the hanging box and throw them into the fire, and afterwards, in the smoke from the burning of these roots, fumigate his sex organs. In the case of a woman, she simply spreads her skirt and stands over the mungal. If it is a man, he either takes off or lets down his trousers and also stands over the said smoke. Only after such a purification can they enter the chief room. Otherwise, as they affirm, not only will evil influences be brought into the house, but owing to these accumulated influences, a man might contract very evil diseases. These sacred mungals are usually screened by the very best jejims, that is, by a special fabric woven only by the Kurds. I repeat, my boy, there exists at the present time on that continent Asia a great many similar customs. I personally saw hundreds of them, which seemed at first sight no less strange and barbarous, but upon a serious and impartial study of their hidden meaning, always revealed one and the same aim, namely, either the destruction of the noxious carriers of various diseases, or the strengthening of moral shame. But on the continent of Europe I scarcely found a single custom specially created either for purposes of hygiene or for instilling morality among the masses. It cannot be denied that various customs also exist on the continent of Europe, even thousands of them, but they are all established only in order that beings may have the possibility of pleasing each other, or to conceal the real state of affairs, that is to say, to disguise the undesirable forms of one's exterior. Undesirable, of course, only according to subjective understanding, and to conceal the nullity of one's own inner significance. These customs existing there progressively increase year by year the duality of the personality and mind of the beings there. But the principal evil lies in this, that at the present time there, all the oskianotsnell of the rising generation, or the education of the children, is rendered and reduced only to the adoption of these innumerable customs which exist among them and engender only immorality. Hence, it is that year by year the data crystallized in them by tens of centuries for the being of an image of God, and not simply, as they themselves would say, of an animal, are on the one hand decrystallized, and on the other hand their psyche is already becoming almost such as our dear teacher defines by the words, "There is everything in him except himself." And indeed, my boy, owing to the complete absence of good patriarchal customs, and to their notorious education, the contemporary beings of that continent have already become completely transformed into what are called automatons, or living mechanical puppets. At the present time, any one of them can become animated and manifest himself outwardly only when there are accidentally pressed the corresponding what are called buttons of those impressions already present in him, which he mechanically perceived during the whole of his preparatory age. But unless these buttons are pressed, the beings there are in themselves only, as again our highly esteemed Mullah Nasr ad-Din says, pieces of pressed meat. It must without fail be remarked here that one of the principal causes of this state of the beings of contemporary civilization is also that same onanism of theirs, a disease which in recent times has come to be almost epidemic there, and which it is in its turn also a consequence again of their education of children, thanks to a certain maleficent idea established among its rulers, and which is already, as it were, an inseparable part of the consciousness of everybody, namely, their maleficent idea that to speak to children about the sex question is absolutely improper. And further, I again emphasize that just this, for their naive reason, trifling idea, the significance of which none of them takes into consideration, considering it simply as what they call a question of decency or indecency, is the chief cause of their having come to this phenomenal, so to say, psychic mechanicality. In the totality of definite understandings, which they call education, there is even a certain section which elucidates and exactly indicates just what is, as they express it, decent and what is indecent to say to children. You must know that at the end of my last sojourn on the surface of your planet, I had to make this maleficent terrestrial question the subject of my special observation, and even to study it in great detail. To know approximately what results the terrestrial contemporary education of children leads to, I will tell you of just that one occurrence which was the first cause of my subsequent special interest in the question of this terrestrial misunderstanding. Although this occurrence took place in the large community of Russia, yet nevertheless this story, which I shall now tell you, is very characteristic and gives a very good picture in general of the education of the children of their contemporary civilization. It is characteristic because in this large community Russia also, the contemporary responsible beings, especially the beings of what is called the upper ruling class, educate their children exactly as the contemporary responsible beings of the other communities breeding on the continents of Europe and America educate theirs. My account of this occurrence, which evoked in me an impulse of interest to acquaint myself specially with the question of the terrestrial education of children, I shall preface with the story of something that occurred just previously to this, and which admirably illustrates the significance of this education of theirs, and was also, so to say, a link in my gradually becoming interested in this question. I happened once to exist continuously for several months in the capital of this community, in the city of St. Petersburg. During my stay there, I became acquainted with an elderly couple. The man was what is called a senator, and his wife was a society lady and a patroness of several welfare institutions. I used to visit them often at their home and enjoyed playing chess with this senator, as is customary there among what are called respectable people. This elderly couple had several daughters. All the elder daughters were already settled, that is, married. Only their youngest daughter, 12 years old, remained at home. As this couple had no further responsibilities concerning their other daughters, they decided to give this youngest daughter of theirs the very best education according to the notions of that time, and for this purpose they placed her in a special boarding school, a higher educational establishment called an institute. This youngest daughter of theirs came home only on Sundays and for the chief holidays, and once a week on special days her father and mother used to visit her at the boarding school. I was almost always with them during the holidays, and I met this charming, as yet unspoiled girl, and sometimes even took walks with her in the neighboring, what is called, park. During these walks, we either joked or she told me about her lessons and her new impressions. During these meetings and conversations, a tie, something like friendship, grew up little by little between us. She was very quick in her perceptions and manifestations, or as your favorites themselves define such persons, from among themselves, an alert and thoughtful girl. My acquaintance, the senator, was sent on a certain, as they say there, inspection, somewhere far off in Siberia. His wife decided to accompany him, for the senator was suffering from what is called liver trouble, and constantly needed care, but they could not make this joint trip because of their youngest daughter, since there would be no one to visit her at the institute and to take her home during the holidays. So, one morning the parents, these elderly acquaintances of mine, came to see me at my apartment and asked me if I would agree to take their place with their youngest daughter during their absence, to visit her every week at the institute, and to take her home with me for the holidays. I, of course, at once agreed to this proposal of theirs, and when, very soon after, the senator and his wife left for Siberia, I began punctually to fulfill the obligations taken upon myself in regard to their daughter, who had by that time become a pet of mine. Upon my first visit to this educational establishment, which existed specially for the education of children, I noticed a certain strange thing, which also served as one of the causes of my subsequent observations and studies of the consequences on your contemporary favorites of that maleficence invented by them themselves. On the day of my visit to this, as they called it, genteel institution, there were many visitors in the reception room, where the meetings of the parents or guardians with their children or wards actually took place. One or two parents or guardians had only just come in. Others were already talking with their children or foster children. Others were waiting the arrival of their children, and all their attention was fixed on the door through which the pupils of that establishment usually entered. I also, after I had come into this reception room and had explained to the inspectress on duty who it was I wished to see, sat down to wait for my chance foster child. While waiting, I looked around. All the pupils of this genteel establishment were dressed alike, and all wore their hair similarly braided in two braids, the ends of which, tied with ribbons, hung down their backs. What struck my eye was a certain peculiarity in these ribbons and braids. On some of the pupils, these ribbons simply hung down the back, but on others, although they also hung down the back, yet the ends of these ribbons were tied together in a certain way. On the very next holiday, when I took my foster child home, talking with her over what is called a samovar, I asked her, "Tell me, Sonia, please, why, although the pupils of your institute dress alike and everything else, there is that peculiarity in the ends of their braids. She immediately blushed, and without answering this question of mine, stared pensively into her tea, and only after a certain time nervously replied, "It's not just a simple thing among us. Although this is our big Institute secret, yet I cannot help telling it to you, my friend, as I am quite sure that you will not give away this big Institute secret of ours to anybody." She proceeded to tell me frankly as follows. The manner of tying our ribbons was intentionally devised by the pupils so that they could recognize one another, that is, know to which club a pupil belongs, and at the same time so that the class teachers and supervisors, and in general anyone not a pupil of the Institute, should not know or discover the secret. All the pupils of our Institute are divided into two categories. One belongs to what is called the Men's Club, and the other to what is called the Women's Club, and we recognize one another just by the manner of tying these ribbons. After this she explained to me in detail in just what the difference between these two clubs lies. She said that, as a rule, all new arrivals in the Institute were at first members of the Women's Club, and only afterwards, if any pupil proved to be daring toward the teachers, or in general showed herself very active in some way or other, then by the common consent of all the pupils, she was enrolled as a member of the Men's Club, and from that moment tied the ends of the ribbons of her two braids together. We usually make the meeting place of our club a spare classroom or dormitory, but more often the toilets. The members of the Men's Club have in general the following privileges. They have the right to choose and to command as many as they like and whom they please of the pupils who are members of the Women's Club, and these latter are obliged always to gratify every wish of the given member of the Men's Club, and do their utmost to make her stay in our boarding school easy for her, as, for example, to make her bed in the morning, copy her lessons, share with her the presents sent from home, and so on and so forth. The chief occupation in the clubs consists of reading together forbidden books procured by one of the pupils. They chiefly read one very rare manuscript obtained with money raised by a General Institute subscription, wherein is expounded in detail the whole of the teaching of the famous poetess Sappho. I must tell you, my boy, that Sappho was the name of a certain Greek poetess who first discovered there on your planet the way to real happiness for many women of the Greek-Roman, as well as of the contemporary civilization. This great creator of women's happiness had her dwelling place on the island of Lesbos, from which word originated the title of those women who have already become worthy to understand and to actualize during the process of their existence the teaching of this remarkable woman, and who at the present time are called lesbians. This foster child of mine, who had chanced to become my enlightener upon the subtleties of the psyche of the beings of the female sex of your planet, further explained to me that every pupil of the Institute who was a member of the Men's Club could choose for herself as many partners as she wished for the common pastime, this, of course, proceeding in full accordance with the teachings of the poetess Sappho. I think that thanks merely to this one fact which I have related to you, out of thousands of other observations of mine, you can already clearly picture to yourself that such a phenomenal ugliness could not exist among the rising generation if the notion was not prevalent there that it is exceedingly indecent to talk to children about the sex question. This notion of decency came down to contemporary civilization by inheritance from the beings of the epoch called the Middle Ages. These candidates for Hasnamuses of the Middle Ages, having been among the chief agents in the destruction of the real meaning of the teaching of the divine teacher Jesus Christ, then also devised and introduced into everyday existence, as a regulation, the maleficent invention which they called bon ton. And this maleficent invention then became so strongly fixed in the psyche of the majority that it became organized for them and began to pass by heredity from generation to generation, so that now your contemporary favorites, who have become completely weak-willed, are unable, however they may try, to overcome such an abnormal psychic fixation as, in the given case, the notion of the indelicacy of talking to their children about the sex question. What? Talk to one's children about sex? Is that not indecent? At the present time, the people of contemporary civilization talk to their children and teach them, for their edification, only what has been invented, or is being invented, in the manuals of various candidates for Hasnamus individuals, under the aforesaid title of bon ton. And since in all these manuals it seems that it is very indecent to talk about the sex question, and in the case of children even immoral, then even if contemporary people see their favorite son or daughter rotting, they simply cannot, and even, as I have already told you, with all their mental wish dare not, explain frankly to their children the harm and sin of these criminal habits. And so, my boy, when my good acquaintances, the senator and his wife, had returned from Siberia, and I was free of the obligations I had taken upon myself in regard to my pet, their youngest daughter, there just then occurred the aforementioned event which served as the beginning of my special observations and studies of this terrestrial, contemporary question, maleficent also to themselves. This sorrowful event occurred there in St. Petersburg itself, in just such another educational institution, and consisted in the following. The headmistress of this institution, finding that one of her pupils had behaved contrary to their famous regulations of decency, reprimanded her so harshly and so unfairly that, as a result, the accused and her friend, two growing girls with the germs of data for future normal women mothers, hanged themselves. My investigations into this case elicited the following. It appeared that among the pupils of the mentioned educational institution was a certain young girl, Elizabeth, who had been brought by her parents from a distant estate to the capital in order that there, in a special higher educational institution, she might receive this same contemporary education. Here in St. Petersburg, in this said boarding school, it happened that this 13-year-old Elizabeth became great friends with another young girl, Mary, who, like herself, was not yet developed. This same year, on the day of the spring holiday, or as it is otherwise called there, May Day, all the pupils of that higher educational institution were taken, according to custom, for an excursion into the country, and these two bosom friends happened to be in different groups, which were walking at some distance from each other. Out in the fields, Elizabeth chanced to see a certain quadruped animal called there a bull, and very much wishing, for some reason or other, that her bosom friend Mary should not miss seeing this dear quadruped animal, she shouted, "Mary, Mary, look, there goes a bull!" No sooner had she uttered the word bull than all the, as they are called, governesses swarmed round this Elizabeth and flung at her all kinds of cruel preachings. How could one utter the word bull? Does not that quadruped animal occupy itself with what no well-brought-up person would on any account speak of, and still less a pupil of such a genteel institution? While the governesses were persecuting this poor Elizabeth, all the pupils of the institute gathered around, and the headmistress herself came up, who, having learned what it was all about, began in her turn to reproach Elizabeth. "Shame on you," she said, "to utter such a word, which is considered so very, very indecent." At last Elizabeth could contain herself no longer, and she asked amid her tears, "What then ought I to have called that quadruped animal if it actually was a bull?" "The word," said the headmistress, "by which you call that animal, any of the scum call it. But you, since you are here in the institute, are not of the scum. So you should always find out how to call indecent things by names which do not sound indecent to the ear. For instance, when you saw that indecent animal and wanted your friend to look at it, you might have shouted, 'Mary, look, there goes a beefsteak,' or 'Mary, look, yonder, there goes something that is very good to eat when we are hungry,' and so forth. From all this, poor Elizabeth became so nervous, especially as this reprimanding took place in the presence of all her friends, that she could not restrain herself, and cried out with all her might, 'Oh, you wretched old maids, striped hobgoblins, spawn of deepest hell! Because I called a thing by its name, you immediately begin to suck my blood. Be thrice damned!' Having said these last words, she fell, as they say there, in a faint, followed in turn by the fainting of the headmistress herself and of several class mistresses and governesses. The class mistresses and governesses of this genteel institution, who had not fainted, then raised such a hubbub as really only occurs at what is called the market, where Jewesses from the town of Gurdjieff exclusively bargain. The result of it all was that when the class mistresses and governesses who had fainted revived, they then and there held in the field, under the presidency of this same headmistress of the institution, what is there called a teachers' council, by whose sentence it was decided immediately on return to town to telegraph Elizabeth's father to come for his daughter, as she was expelled from the institute with loss of right to enter any other similar institute in the Russian Empire. The same day and hour after the pupils were sent home, one of what are called the porters of the institute happened to find in the woodshed that two as yet undeveloped growing future mothers were hanging by ropes fastened to the beams. In Mary's pocket was found a note with the contents: "Together with my dear Elizabeth, I do not wish to live any longer with such non-entities as you, and I am going with her to a better world." This case then so interested me that I began, of course, privately to investigate, psychoanalytically, from every aspect, the psyche of all the parties in this sad story. I partly elucidated, among other things, that at that moment of the manifestation of her violent outburst, there was in the psyche of poor Elizabeth what is called there chaos. And indeed it would have been astonishing if such a chaos had not been in the psyche of this as yet unself-conscious 13-year-old girl, who before this miserable event had always lived on her father's big estate, where she had always seen and felt the same richness of nature as on that day in the field near the city of St. Petersburg. She had been brought to that stifling, noisy city of St. Petersburg, and had been kept for a long time in an improvised box. Suddenly she had found herself in an environment where every fresh impression evoked all kinds of memories of former pleasantly perceived sensations. On your planet, during what is called early spring, there are indeed sometimes pictures to the charm of which it is difficult not to yield. Picture to yourself the following. Afar, cows are seen at pasture. Near at one's feet, snowdrops shyly peep out from the earth. Close to one's ear, a little bird flies by. To the right is heard the twittering of quite an unknown bird. On the left, one's sense of smell is quickened by the perfume of some also unknown flower. In short, at such moments as these, in the beings there, especially in one so young as Elizabeth, finding themselves after a long period of oppressive existence in a suffocating city, in the midst of such a rich abundance of all kinds of unaccustomed impressions, the mental associations evoked from a natural being joy would naturally arise of themselves from every external thing perceived. Elizabeth must have felt this especially strongly, having lived, as I have already said, before the Institute, on her father's large estate, which lay far from the already exceedingly abnormal conditions of city vanities. Thanks to this, every impression newly perceived by her would naturally call up previous childhood memories, each connected in its turn with various other pleasant incidents. So it is not difficult to picture to yourself that the sudden appearance of that quadruped animal called bull, such as she had seen at home on the farm, and which had enjoyed there the affection of all the children, who secretly even took it bread from the table, was to this as yet unformed impressionable young girl a shock for the corresponding associations under the influence of which she, being full of a feeling of sincere happiness, still unspoiled by the abnormally established conditions of being existence, instantly wished to share her happiness with her bosom friend who was some distance off, and shouted to her to look at that dear bull. Now I ask you, how should she have called this quadruped being, since it actually was a bull? Really, beefsteak, as advised by the esteemed headmistress of this esteemed higher educational institution, which existed there specially for the education of children, according to the barbarous system of theirs existing there to their misfortune, also at the present time. As you see, my boy, intending to tell you a little more about the three-brained beings who have interested you and who breed on that continent of North America, I have, by the way, said a great deal in general about the three-brained beings arising and existing on all the continents of that peculiar planet. I don't think you will have any grievance against me for this, since you have at the same time managed to learn many more facts elucidating the details of their strange psyche. Concerning especially what is called the degree of degeneration of the common presences of those who compose this contemporary large group on the continent America in respect of the loss of possibilities for the acquisition of being nearer to the normal being of three-brained beings in general, I can tell you something somewhat consoling for them, namely that in my opinion there remains among them the largest percentage of beings in whose presences the said possibility is not entirely lost. Although this new group is composed of and still continues to be increased by three-brained beings breeding on the continent of Europe, where for such beings with the aforementioned possibilities it is already necessary, particularly in recent times, as our wise teacher Mullah Nasr ad-Din says on such occasions, to look especially with the most powerful electric arc lamps. Nevertheless, I repeat, in this large group there is a larger percentage of such beings than on the continent of Europe. It seems to me that this has happened because there have migrated there, and still now migrate from the continent of Europe, beings chiefly from among what are called the simple beings, who are not, so to say, the hereditary offspring of the European beings belonging to the ruling caste, in whom, thanks to transmission by inheritance from generation to generation during long centuries of predisposition to Hasnamusian properties, there is at the present time so much of what is called inner swagger that it would never permit them to blend with the general mass in order to strive together with common efforts to become such three-brained beings as they should be. Thanks only to the fact that among the three-brained beings breeding on that continent there were only very few of the offspring of the ruling caste, and that the general mass of beings was in itself a medium in which it was still possible for our brother to exist and not be under the influence of those local radiations which are formed owing to surrounding beings, and which act harmfully on what are called the subjectively natural inner forces of every being. I was therefore able, during my stay among them, to rest as I desired. Now, my boy, that I have spent so much of my time explaining the meaning of all the various innovations and all the renewals of former pernicious customs, which had already many times existed on their planet, among the beings of this big new contemporary grouping, and which have already at the present time become, in the objective sense, harmful not only for them themselves, but also for all the other three-brained beings who have interested you, and who breed on quite other continents. It is therefore, in my opinion, already unavoidably necessary for a, so to say, closing chord, to initiate you also into those of my thoughts, which began in my mentation on the last day of my sojourn among them in the city of New York, and which ended on the steamer as it was moving away from the continent toward the east. On that day I was sitting in one of the singular cafes there named Child's, situated at what is called Columbus Circle, awaiting the beings from the continent Europe who had accompanied me to this continent, to go with them to the dock of the outgoing steamer. And I was looking out of the window at the various passing beings from among the inhabitants of that city, who, although according to automatized perception were distinguishable on that day in exterior appearance, of course chiefly due to the usage recently fixed in them, more than in any beings of any other continents, of becoming slaves to always that same maleficent terrestrial invention, which they call fashion, nevertheless somehow seemed to me, in respect of their inner content, particularly alike. Observing them, I thought just about the final deduction I had made the day before, that in the present period of the flow of the Herapas, in the common planetary process of the ordinary existence of those in general strange three-brained beings, the source of the intensive manifestation of that already long established particularity of the general totality of their strange psyche, which one of the highest sacred individuals once characterized by the words, the periodic fundamental source of the issuing of new causes of abnormality, is represented just by the beings of this new grouping. The shock for the beginning of associations and for my further active meditations this time was the constatation I happened to make of the fact that everything constituting what is called the totality of the subjective appearance of each one of them, such as clothes, gestures, manners, and in general all the established usages which all three-brained beings acquire in the ordinary process of their collective existence, is a totally exact imitation exclusively only of all that exists among the beings of various other independent groupings, breeding on other continents, an imitation of just that which is considered by the free beings of these other groupings, that is to say, by those beings among them who have already experienced and consequently been disappointed in everything the process of ordinary existence can give, as unworthy of manifestation by beings similar to them. This accidental constatation of mine at once very much astonished me, chiefly because I was already informed from every aspect and wholly convinced that in the present period everywhere on this planet, the beings of almost all the other groupings, those recently formed as well as those which are at a very advanced stage of their community, imitate to the full all the innovations of the beings of this still quite recently formed grouping, and enthusiastically adopt these innovations in the process of their ordinary existence, and at the same time all the external manifestations of the beings of this new grouping, and consequently the inner subjective significance which engenders these external manifestations, consist only of that which, as I have already said, has become to the great grief of the free beings of these other independent groupings fixed and inherent in the common presences of the ordinary beings of these groupings. In consequence of this unexpected constatation of mine, there then arose in me a highly intensive impulse of curiosity to make clear to myself the logical causes which had engendered this terrestrial incongruity. All that day, while sitting in this child's, awaiting the arrival of the beings from the continent of Europe, who had accompanied me, and while riding in the motor taxi, and also while on the boat itself, I continued to ponder very actively the solution of this question, of course appearing to strangers as an automatic observer of everything proceeding around me, and in the ability outwardly to appear such, in order to resemble them in this respect, and thus not be, so to say, conspicuous, or as they say there, not to strike the eye. I became there, on the earth, ideally, or as they would say artistically, expert. Sitting on the deck, looking at the twinkling of the lights on the shore of this continent, gradually growing fainter as the steamer moved away towards the east, and pondering over and logically comparing all the facts ensuing one from the other, I, as a result, made it almost entirely clear to myself just why and how the said incongruity could have arisen on this ill-fated planet. At the beginning of these ponderings of mine, I established many facts which had enabled this to arise, but afterwards, when I began successively to exclude those which inevitably ensue, as is done in such cases, then, as a result, one fact became clear to me, which, though at first glance insignificant, astonished even me, and which, as it turned out, was, all the time, and still is, the originating cause of this abnormality there. And that is to say, it turned out that, owing to the consequences of that same famous education of theirs, so many times mentioned by me, there inevitably arise in the common presence of each of them in general, during his age of preparatory for responsible existence, to whatever independent group he may belong, data for the definite conviction that in the former epochs on their planet, the beings similar to them had never perfected themselves to that reason to which their contemporaries have attained, and in which they can still continue to perfect themselves. When my thoughts were concentrated on this, and I began to recall my former impressions concerning this question, those consciously and also those incidentally and automatically perceived during my previous observations of them in general, I gradually established that all your favorites, particularly in the last 30 centuries, had indeed become convinced during all their responsible existence that their contemporary, what they call civilization, is simply the result of the direct continuation of the development of the reason, which began at the very commencement of the arising of three-brained beings on their planet. And so when the beings, their contemporaries of any grouping, owing to the formation in them, while still in their preparatory age of new data for this false conviction, accidentally became the possessors of something which is accounted in the given period desirable, and thereby acquire authority, and at the same time find out, of course also accidentally, about some idea of the beings of past epochs which has already existed many times, and, giving it out as having been thought of by themselves, spread it around, then the beings of other groupings, through the absence in their common presences, due to wrong education, of the data which it is proper to all three-brain beings of responsible age to have in their presences, and which engender what are called an instinctive sensing of reality and a broad outlook, believe in the first place that this idea has arisen on their planet for quite the first time, and secondly, that once the practical application of it has been actualized by those who already possess the said something desirable, then it must indeed be very good, and they forthwith begin to imitate everything really good as well as bad, notwithstanding its complete contrariety to everything there is and to everything well fixed in their ordinary existence, merely in order to possess that which for today is considered desirable. I then even remembered that I had already once, long before, very seriously reflected on this matter, in the period of my 5th personal sojourn on the surface of your planet, when the city of Babylon was considered the center of culture of these strange three-brained beings, and when I had, on account of some similar question, to make a logical analysis of just this strange feature of the psyche of these peculiar three-brained beings. I then, among other things, also reasoned as follows, that they think this may perhaps be possibly justified by taking it into consideration that, owing to the abnormal conditions of ordinary existence established in past epochs, no exact information has reached them about events which have occurred in the past, in the process of the existence of the three-brained beings who existed before them on their planet. But how is it possible to admit that up till now there has not arisen in the mentation of any one of them, in whom it has already been established that even until quite recently there does sometimes proceed a something similar to the process of comparative logic, at least the following simple and almost, as they themselves would call it, childish idea? And namely, if, as they themselves say, and are even certain, that their planet has already existed many, many centuries, with their species on it, beings similar to them, that is to say, beings who could mentate, and that many, many millions of them must have also arisen and existed before them, would there really not have been, then, from among these many, many millions, at least a few beings who could also have invented, for the well-being of their contemporaries, all kinds of comforts, as in the given case these contemporary American beings are now inventing, and all the others are uncritically and even rapturously imitating, as for example comfortable seats in the water closets, preserves, and so on and so forth. This unpardonable lack of thought is all the more strange in that they themselves admit the existence of many, as they now call them, ancient sages, and also do not deny the great amount of most varied information which has come down to them concerning the many objective truths elucidated by these sages. Which information, by the way, certain of your favorites at the present time are, without any remorse of conscience, giving out as having been thought of by themselves, and exploiting to the full for their various egoistic aims, without at all suspecting that the totality of the results of these wiseacrings of theirs will inevitably lead their descendants, sooner or later, to total destruction. This particularity of their mentation, very complicated for any logical analysis, undertaken for the purpose of understanding it, engendering in them this false conviction, was during the whole of my observation of them, beginning with the end of the existence of the continent Atlantis, always, so to say, the gravity, center cause, of almost all the more or less major events unfavorable for them in the process of their collective existence. Thanks to this false conviction, the result of their strange mentation, and in addition, thanks to the effect on the totality of the functioning of their feelings, of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, which inevitably arise in their presences at responsible age, and which are called envy, greed, and jealousy. It always happens there that when the beings of any grouping become the possessors of anything which in the given period is considered desirable, in most cases because of that maleficent practice fixed in their everyday existence, which they express by the words, not to cease progressing, there immediately arises in the common presences of all the beings of other groupings, on whatever continents they may breed, as soon as the rumor of this reaches them, the desire to have the same, and from that moment there arises in each of them, firstly, the need to imitate them, and secondly, the indubitable certainty that the beings of this other grouping must exist very correctly, since they have been able to acquire just what in the given period is accounted desirable. In this connection, the so to say piquancy of the strangeness of the mentation of your favorites is that there never occurs in their mentation the process called to ponder, in order to understand, if only approximately, the true causes of the possession by others of that on account of which there arise in them envy, greed, jealousy, and so on. And so, my boy, in spite of the fact that as far as the acquisition, and hence the possession of the results attained by the conscious labors and intentional sufferings of the three-brained beings of past epochs of their planet are concerned, the beings of their new group have absolutely nothing at all, but consist as to inner content, as well as to exterior manifestations, only of everything bad that exists among contemporary beings of other independent groupings, solely because in recent times they have accidentally become the possessors of just that which, in the objective sense, is most despicable, yet which, owing in general to the fixed abnormal conditions of the ordinary existence of these unfortunates, is considered desirable. Nevertheless, the beings of all the other groupings now imitate to the full everything they invent. Of all the maleficent inventions of the beings of this contemporary grouping which have accidentally acquired authority, the most harmful for their common presences, in respect of the possibility of rectifying in the future the so to say already actualized maleficences, must be considered the practice they have established of passing a great part of the time of their existences in high houses. In order that you may clearly picture to yourself the significance of all the harm from just this invention of theirs, I must first of all explain to you the following. Do you remember when I spoke to you about that maleficent means existing there, at the present time called sport? I said that the duration of the existence of these favorites of yours was in the beginning also phoulos nitomnian. That is to say, they had to exist until their body Kesdjan was completely coated in them and perfected up to the required gradation of reason, and that afterwards, when very abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence began to be established there, great nature was constrained to actualize their presences and also the subsequent process of their existence on the principle of itoklanos. that is, according to the results of certain surrounding causes. Thereafter, one of these causes has also been the degree of the density of the vibrations of their second being food. That is, as they themselves would say, the degree of condensation of the air they breathe. The point is that this cosmic formation, which serves as the second food for beings, is also composed according to the second fundamental common cosmic law of the sacred Triamazikamno, and is also actualized by means of its three heterogeneous cosmic substances. And namely, the first is the emanation of the sun of that system, in which this same definite cosmic arising serves as the second food for beings. The second are the substances transformed on that planet itself, on which the beings fed by this food exist. And the third are those substances which are transformed through the other planets of this system, and which come to the given planet through their radiations. And so the process of fusion of all those substances required for the normal formation and existence of beings, which are transformed by the planet itself, and which actualize the second holy force of the sacred Triamazikamno, can proceed in the correspondingly required definite proportion only within certain limits of the atmosphere from the surface of planets, because owing to the second great cosmic law called Tenikdoa, or as your favorites would call it, law of gravity, these substances cannot penetrate beyond a definite height of the atmosphere. In my opinion, you can yourself apprehend all the subsequent ensuing consequences of this question, which I have just now brought to light, and compose data in yourself for your own opinion of the significance of this invention of theirs. I think, my boy, that I have now already fully satisfied your curiosity concerning these dollar foxtrotting followers of what is called Christian Science. In the name of objective justice, it now only remains for me to remark that whatever they may turn into in the future, I had, however, during my existence among them, the possibility of inwardly resting, and for this I ought now to express to them my sincere thanks. And you, just you, my heir, to whom has already been transmitted, and will be transmitted by inheritance, everything acquired by me during my long existence, of course, only in so far as you yourself will deserve it by your own conscientious being existence and honorable service to the all-common Father, maintainer, our endlessness. I command you, if you happen for some reason or other to be on the planet Earth, to visit without fail the city of New York, or if by that time this city should no longer exist, then at least stop at that place where it was situated, and to utter aloud, "In this place my beloved grandfather, my just teacher Beelzebub, pleasantly passed a few moments of his existence." I even charge you, of course, again as the heir to whom, as is general, will devolve the fulfillment of the obligations which his predecessor took upon himself, and which for some reason or other were left unfulfilled, specially to turn your attention to and to elucidate a question which greatly interested me and which I personally was unable to elucidate, as it was still premature to do so. That is to say, I charge you to elucidate for yourself into what a maleficent form for their descendants, if of course by that time their descendants still continue to arise, will the results have become molded of the disease very widespread at that time, which one of their misters by name Onenson called writing itch. And indeed, my boy, having then, during my stay there, a more or less close relationship with many of them, I very soon found out that almost every one of them either had already written a book, or at that time was writing one, or was getting ready quickly to burst into authorship. Although this peculiar disease was then, as I have already said, widespread among almost all the beings of this continent, and moreover among the beings of both sexes, and without distinction of age, yet among the beings at the beginning of responsible age, that is, as they themselves say, among the youth, and particularly among those who had many pimples on their faces, it was, for some reason or other, as it is said, epidemical. I must further remark, in just this connection, that there flourished that specific particularity of the strangeness of the common psyche of these peculiar beings who have taken your fancy, which has already long existed in their collective existence, and which has been formulated by the following words: the concentration of interests on an idea which has accidentally become the question of the day. Here also, many of them who turned out to be a little, as is said there, more cunning, and in whom the data for the being impulse called instinctively to refrain from all manifestations which may lead surrounding beings similar to oneself into error, were more atrophied, organized various what are called schools, and composed all kinds of manuals in which much attention was given to showing in detail just what the sequence of words should be, so that all compositions should be better perceived and assimilated by the reader. And thus all those attending these schools, and all readers of these manuals, being themselves, in regard to being, and in regard to information concerning reality, exactly such types as our teacher Mullah Nasr ad-Din defined by the words nullities with an atmosphere of unendurable vibrations, began, according to these indications, to wiseacre. And since, in the first place, thanks to various other abnormalities fixed in the conditions of the ordinary existence of the beings of this new grouping, the process of reading has previously in general become an organic need of theirs, and secondly, that it was possible to appreciate the contents of any composition exclusively only by reading it through, and all the other beings of this continent seduced, what is more, by all kinds of, as they say there, loud titles, read and read. Then, parallel with this, it was definitely noticeable how their mentation, which had already, so to say, become diluted, without this, continued to become more diluted, and still more diluted. I did not lightly say that if by that time their descendants still continue to arise, because among other things I then noticed that same extraordinary particularity in respect of the consequences of the new formation of the planetary body of beings of the female sex, which I had already once noticed, long before, in the process of the ordinary existence of these strange three-brained beings, and parallel with this, I minutely constated, among other special observations, the consequences ensuing from this particularity. This extraordinary fact occurred there before the loss of the continent Atlantis, in the process of the existence of a small group of three-brained beings who were concentrated from various large groupings of that time, and who existed in isolation on the then famous island called Balakanira, situated on the west of Atlantis, and which was engulfed within the planet at the same time as Atlantis itself. The continuation of the race of this small group ceased owing to this same strange particularity of the formation of the planetary body of the beings of the female sex, and this form of cessation of the race was then called by the learned members of the society Alcodan desubcentoziroso. This extraordinary particularity was that several centuries before the final cessation of their race, there began gradually to narrow in their beings in the female sex what is called the pelvis. The progressiveness of this narrowing was such that 2 centuries before the final cessation of their race, they were already producing all the accidental conceptions in them, and the, so to say, haphazard forming of these conceptions for their appearance, as is said there, in God's world, by the means then called citric, namely, by means of what is now called Caesarean operations. At this point of Beelzebub's tales, what is called a cross-current or agitation began in the ether, which penetrated the whole of the ship Karnak. This signified that the passengers of the ship Karnak were summoned to the Jampal, that is, that refectory of the ship in which all the passengers together periodically fed on the second and first being foods. So Beelzebub, Hastian, and Ahun ceased their conversation and hastily went off to the Jampal.